Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to this roundtable. I won't introduce really the panel or the panelists. Charlie Hale, the director of the Lozano Long Latin American Institute, or Institute for Latin American Studies, is going to do that. I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of Karen Engel and myself. We're the co-directors of the Rapoport Center for Human Rights and Justice, and we're co-sponsoring the panel with LLILAS. And all I wanted to do in a minute or so is to highlight the way in which this panel is the beginning of what we hope to be doing over the next 4.5 years or so in the context of a larger project on inequality and human rights. So this is really the first of what we hope to be a long series of in-depth discussions and analyses of spaces where decisions are taken that seek to improve human rights and the human rights outcomes for different groups of people. We call these spaces sort of sites of governance, places where now human rights decision making is taking place. We typically think of human rights as being sort of the stuff of international law and the stuff of international courts or commissions or the UN and various parts of the UN, but really human rights work is increasingly taking place in lots of different spaces. And in that sense, this panel exemplifies one of those spaces, right? It brings together producers, retailers, consumers, and workers in an attempt to make human rights effective for groups of people that we often don't even think of as the subject of human rights, right? People who work and who may be crossing national boundaries and products that cross national boundaries and so on. So that's one of the things that this panel does that exemplifies what we're going to be doing over the next few years. It takes aim at one of these new or maybe not so new sites of governance where human rights decisions are made. The panel also includes both academics and practitioners, and hopefully reflective, not hopefully, really reflective practitioners, people who think carefully about what they're doing and engage in conversations. And we hope that these panels will actually give us a chance to think about what the work that is being done is actually accomplishing and how it might be done differently or better, or how it's doing really well already, in a way that can be instructive for us as academics, for students here, for people who want to be practitioners in the future. The panel brings together two issues that we hope to tackle over the next 5 years. So the future of labor and labor rights and how people do their work and how we regulate that work and what kinds of rights they have in that work. That's something that we're going to be looking at. And also natural resources, natural resource extraction and production and governance. And that's another thing we're going to be looking at with more care. So in a way, this panel brings together all the things that we're going to be doing over the next 4.5 years or so. It's a new look at new tools, new spaces, new topics, new issues, all in a context of deepening inequality and the kinds of issues that really matter to people, like where they work and the kinds of products that they consume and what they do with their money and that sort of thing. So we really look forward to starting this discussion. We really look forward to continuing the discussion over the next 4 years or so. Welcome to all of you, and welcome especially to the panelists. And now I'll just turn it over to Charlie to introduce the rest. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlie Hale. I'm Director of LLILAS Benson, Latin American Studies and Collections. And it's really a great pleasure to be co-sponsoring this event with this dialogue with Rapoport Center. It's a topic that's extremely timely and important because of the work that the Rapoport Center is going to be doing or is doing that Dan described. I think also because it touches on so many fundamental issues that people in conditions of oppression, of struggle for rights, of struggle for betterment confront. And I think it's also an area or of concern that has a whole lot of resonance in an interlocking, overlapping set of spheres of practitioners, of activists, of organizations, and I think is actually a little bit understudied. from the point of view from the point of view of academia. So I'm really glad that certification, as the title says, do consumers have a role in monitoring and pressing for human rights and equality? I think these are really crucial issues for us to be dealing with, and we have a very well qualified and distinguished panel to discuss them with us. It's pretty much of a discussion format. In that we're going to hear about from each of the panelists for about 5 minutes. Then I'm going to pose a few questions based on questions that have been generated by the panelists and by previous discussion among them. And then we're going to have plenty of time to open it up for discussion among all of you. One more prefatory word. Certification is not something that I have studied for very long, but thanks to our first panelist and to other factors, I've gotten involved in a study on certification, the relationship between forestry certification and the Mapuche people in southern Chile, which José is also going to talk about. And so I'm particularly interested from my own research point of view in what we're going to learn from this panel. So let me briefly introduce the five, and I think I'll introduce them in the order that they will speak. They'll each speak for 5 minutes, as I said, and then we'll open it up. First, we have Dr. Michael Conroy, who's online. Are you still there, Mike?
Absolutely.
Good. He's sort of the godlike voice here. Mike Conroy was a much-loved, revered professor of economics here at UT for 25 years, probably before most of you were here to appreciate him. In fact, I got here just the year that he decided to leave and go on to do the second part of his practitioner activist career. So I was a little disappointed not to overlap with him here, but very excited to hear the work that he did for the next period of his career, working at the Ford Foundation and then Rockefeller Brothers on really providing an important role in thinking through precisely this topic, thinking through and supporting and helping to organize what he calls in a later published book, The Certification Revolution. He also serves as board chair of an organization called Equitable Origin, which is an NGO that's developed the only certification process for social and environmental accountability for global energy development. And he's a member of the International Board of the Forest Stewardship Council, the FSC, which you'll be hearing a lot about. He served as board chair of that entity from 2011 to 2014. And also, we're very proud to have him as a research fellow at the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Charlie.
José Aylwin is from Chile. He's a human rights lawyer, works on indigenous peoples and citizens' rights in Chile and throughout Latin America, and he's co-director of the Observatorio Ciudadano, Citizens Watch, a human rights NGO based in Temuco and Santiago. He's also adjunct professor of law at the Universidad Austral de Chile in Valdivia, Chile. He teaches on the rights of indigenous peoples. And he's a member of the research team that I also participate in, and so I can attest firsthand that when power holders in countries like Chile hear that José Aylwin is a member of the research team that's studying issues that concern them, they develop a distinct disquiet, which suggests, I think, speaks volumes to the important work and the effectiveness that he and his organization have had over the last really 2 decades. So welcome, and José Aylwin is a visiting resource professor who was nominated by the Rapoport Center to come, and felicitously has a lot of connections with LLILAS. He's here for 2 weeks, and the resource part means that although he has a lot of his own work to do, he's also available as a resource to all of you, and of course in events like this one. So welcome, José. Jessica Champagne is Director and Research and Advocacy for Workers' Rights Consortium, an independent labor rights monitoring organization. She coordinates investigations in apparel factories around the world and engages with international apparel brands and retailers to correct violations. Advocacy by Jessica and her team has resulted in millions of dollars being paid to garment workers who were denied legally required compensation. And I'm very happy to announce that UT Austin is a member of their organization. I hope that means that we're complying, and if not, I hope we'll hear about it. Welcome, Jessica. Sean Sellers is co-founder and senior investigator at the Fair Food Council and a staff member of the newly created Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Collaborative. Founding groups of that collaborative include Fair Food Standards Council, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, where Sean worked for many years. I guess still does it since the two are connected. The Workers' Right Consortium, which I just spoke of, the Migrant Justice, and among others. The collaborative aims to draw a sharp distinction between traditional corporate responsibility and multi-stakeholder initiatives on the one hand and worker-driven social responsibility on the other. And this is a case where the bio, which Sean provided, is also a salvo in the discussion that we're about to have. So I hope you heard that last sentence well. And finally, he didn't put in his bio, but it's probably the most important part of his bio, is that he got his MA in Latin American Studies here at UT. He's a proud alum of our program, and we're really thrilled, Sean, to have you back. He's also recruited all kinds of students from here to the Immokalee Workers and to his new organization, including Professor Brinks' son. So it's lots of connections that are building because of Sean's presence here. Finally, Julia Dehm is postdoctoral fellow at the Rapoport Center of Human Rights and Justice at the University of Texas, Austin, working on the multi-year project that Dan described, Rethinking Human Rights in the 21st Century. Julia was previously a resident fellow at the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School and junior faculty member at a workshop in Doha, Qatar, in January 2015. And she just submitted her PhD at the Melbourne Law School entitled Reconsidering Red Plus, Law, Life, Limits, and Growth in Crisis. And I have to say, Julia is really the driving force behind the organization and conception of this panel, which is not to shirk any responsibility if things don't go well, but I'm sure they'll go great, and if they do, Julia is more responsible than anyone else in this room. So thank you, Julia, for your hard work, and thank you all. Let's get started. Mike.
Charlie, thank you very much for that overly extensive introduction. It is for me a great pleasure to serve on a panel with José Aylwin, whose father I have met, the former president of Chile, with Jessica Champagne from Workers' Rights Consortium. I've followed their work since their very founding a number of years ago. With Sean Sellers, with whom I have had positive, intense, and multiple dialogues about different approaches to the best way to protect the rights of farm workers. And to Julia, to whom I suggested, well, if you can't see my picture, then maybe it's appropriate because I may only exist in the ether. So, do we have the first slide up that I sent to you?
As in the first real one or the title?
The title slide, yeah, that's all. You know, this is a very long presentation consisting of a total of 3 slides. So let's go to the second slide, who claims to incorporate human rights in their certification standards. To begin with, the FSC, with whom I have worked very closely for almost 20 years. I can't claim to have been there at the beginning, but I picked up soon after the beginning and worked in support of the FSC on several labels. FSC requirements in its principles and criteria include full ILO labor rights, protection of indigenous rights, and protection of the rights of local communities in all areas where there are certified forests. The FSC has now certified 180 million hectares of forests around the world in 80 different countries, including easily 10% of all the world's working forests, excluding protected areas and national parks and so forth. It is a very important element of the FSC system that human rights must be protected, and if anyone is interested, I can talk about specific ways in which we have applied what we call the nuclear option, total disassociation from the FSC, total ban on the use of our name or logo in a number of cases where human rights were violated in Africa and other places. I also work, as Charlie suggested, with Equitable Origin, Inc., voluntary certification system focused on total energy production, whether oil and gas or renewable energy, and we demand compliance with free, prior, and informed consent, respect for labor rights, and protection of the environment at all production sites of energy, not just oil and gas. The Equitable Food Initiative is, as Sean will discuss perhaps, a competitor to the Fair Food Initiative with whom he works, in the sense that it is based upon the United Farm Workers. It focuses primarily on farm worker rights and the rights of consumers to food safety, but it in fact trains workers and trains managers of farms on the rights of workers and the need to respect those rights, and then provides recourse if any worker complains to a 1-800 anonymous line about a violation of those rights. I was also associated for some time with Fair Trade USA and also the International Fair Trade Organization called FLO, Fair Trade Labeling Organizations International, which has aspirations of having impacts on rights in a number of levels, but I would argue, and Sean might agree with me, the most that it really incorporates into its standards is a prohibition on child labor in agriculture. And it's been particularly active around the elimination of child labor in the production of cocoa in West Africa. But it also protects reproductive rights, teaches women at fair trade certified farms about their rights, and especially in flour production, this has had a major impact, which I can discuss if anyone else is interested. Let's move to the last slide in my very long presentation. And the last slide simply raises a question about one of the questions of this conference. Can consumers monitor human rights? My response is to suggest that that may not be the right question. Perhaps what we should be asking not is, can we ask of consumers that they monitor human rights in every product that they consume? Or should we be asking, do consumers care about the respect for rights? And if so, which rights? In the work that I've done over the last 15 years in this field, we find many surveys that show that consumers do care about labor rights, do care about the conditions faced by workers, and will make a difference in their purchases on the basis of that concern. One of the best examples is an experimental economics argument that was done on eBay, showing that people would pay up to 50% more for a polo shirt that had a claim of respecting worker rights compared to a polo shirt that had no claim of that sort. Second question I would ask is, can these systems provide some assurance to consumers about respect for rights? And I think that varies from system to system, depending upon how they're structured, depending on the severity of their auditing, and depending upon their communication with consumers. I would also ask, can markets be used to stimulate greater respect for human rights? And I think the answer there is resoundingly yes. People are concerned about rights, people respond in markets, companies are embarrassed when they're caught violating rights. A wide variety of companies have changed their policies on the basis of attention drawn by the Human Rights and Business Center and a number of other groups about their rights practices. Can corporations be moved to incorporate greater respect for human rights? The answer again is definitely. It depends on how you approach them. It depends upon the fundamental ethos of the company, but I'm happy to report that worldwide, this is becoming a more important dimension of the protection of reputation on the part of global corporations worldwide. Can naming and shaming be used to increase attention to rights violations? Again, this is the most important instrument that civil society has now for changing the behavior of major corporations with respect to human rights. My final question would be, what are the limits to these mechanisms for protecting rights? And I think the limits are partly on the part of the consumer side. It depends on the attitudes of consumers themselves. Some consumers are very sensitive, other consumers are totally insensitive to this. It also depends upon the ability of the corporation and the groups that provide assurance around their practices to reach out to consumers. So the greater the ability of certification systems to identify those companies that respect human rights, labor rights, women's rights, worker rights, farm worker rights, the greater the likelihood that consumers and markets will change those practices. And we have lots of evidence that it's beginning to happen in a really important way. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. José Aylwin.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Rapoport Center for Human Rights and the LLILAS Lozano Long Institute for Latin American Studies for inviting me not only to this panel, but as a resource visiting professor here. I'm pleased to be here and to share my experience in a field which is specifically the field of this topic and this project that in which the center is involved on natural resource governance and human rights. 5 minutes is a very short period of time, so I try to focus on 4 points. Perhaps Michael helped me with the first point, which is what is FSC, forest plantations in Chile, FSC role in Chile, and finally the research project in which we are engaged with Charles and a group of Mapuche researchers dealing with certification process in Chile and human rights, and more specifically indigenous rights. Perhaps I should add to the introduction that Michael made on FSC, that for those who don't know, FSC was emerged in the 90s in the context of the Earth Summit, in the context of global forest devastation, and it brings together different sectors involved with forest activities. So it's a tripartite organization, including forest producers, communities, local communities and indigenous peoples, and environmental organizations concerned with the future of forests. And it aims at the promotion of responsible forest management, which is conceived as environmentally appropriate, socially beneficial, and economically viable. And the main guidelines that orient the action of FSC are the global principles and criteria for good forest management. They were first enacted in the 90s and have been modified a couple of times, and FSC members in different states have to adapt those standards to their domestic practices, and that's a very complex process. But the criteria that are in effect currently were approved in 2012, and basically, as Michael said, the main principles are compliance not only with domestic legislation but with international treaties and conventions, including human rights conventions ratified by states, and workers' rights is at the center, indigenous people's rights, community rights, environmental rights are at the center of these principles and criteria. Concerning indigenous people's rights, which is a topic that we're dealing with in the context of our research, it includes not only those rights that were acknowledged in the 90s by Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization, but also rights to lands, rights to customary and legal property by indigenous peoples, and rights to free, prior, informed consent with regards to these forest activities. So those are the principles that orient FSC action. Regarding the Chilean context, forest plantations, exotic forest plantations were encouraged and were promoted since 1974 by the military regime through a system of subsidies that went largely to private holdings, to Chilean private holdings, some of them also with investments from abroad. These resulted in strong subsidies to plantation, to management of forests, and to 2.8 million hectares of exotic tree plantations in southern Chile, overlapping in a substantial way with the traditional lands, both legally and customarily owned by the Mapuche people. Almost 1.5 million hectares are planted in 3 regions, which are the traditional territory of the Mapuche people. There's 2 corporations, Chilean-owned private corporations that own 1.8 million hectares, largely in this area. Impacts on Mapuche rights have been addressed by different, of course, by indigenous organizations, by human rights organizations. They have been a concern of international organizations, by Human Rights Committee, UN committees, and also addressed in cases adjudicated at the Inter-American Human Rights System. Largely overlaps, as mentioned. Benefits are not shared. These are the poorest regions in the country. The municipalities where plantations are grounded coincide with the 10 poorest municipalities in the country. They generate migration and degradation of ecosystems and water shortage in a context of climate change, which is another concern of Rapoport Center. This was a context in which Chilean corporation and largely these big corporations became a part of FSC in the year 2000. They previously had a domestic certification process that did not allow their products to enter into global markets. So in the year 2000, FSC Chile was established, and currently it has certified 23 forest corporations, including those large ones, with a total of 2.3 million hectares out of the 2.8 million hectares of exotic plantations. Just to mention that domestic legislation does not require EIA, environmental impact assessment of plantations or management of forest areas which are smaller than 500 hectares. So that means that 2.8 million hectares have not been assessed in an environmental process. This was a context in which a group of Mapuche people, organizations, the Mapuche are the largest indigenous people in Chile with more than 1 million members, presented a complaint to FSC International and basically arguing that certification had been established without fulfilling the principles and the criteria of FSC in effect. So basically our research, and I'll leave it there because I've already reached the 5 minutes, has been addressing and assessing in different territories where these corporations are based, how these principles were complied with or not complied with. Thank you.
And discussion period, you'll get a chance to ask José what the preliminary findings of this research are. Sure.
Yeah.
Sean.
In the early 2000s, federal prosecutors called Florida ground zero for modern slavery. This was in the aftermath of several high-profile forced labor prosecutions that took place in the agricultural industry, many of which were in the tomato industry. 2 years ago, the New York Times ran a front-page story that called this same industry the best working environment in American agriculture. So this is a story of remarkable transformation that was led by a worker community that really took charge of its own destiny. Agriculture has long been synonymous with just some of the most difficult, dangerous, and lowest paid work you can hope to do in this country, that you don't need an advanced degree to know that. Florida has a very large ag industry, behind only California. In the early 1990s, there was a wave of Mexican, Guatemalan, and Haitian immigration to Southwest Florida. Many of these workers had experience in political organizing and in social movements and formed the Coalition of Immokalee Workers to improve their conditions. The industry at that time was rife with abuse and essentially functioned as a kind of day labor pool. Workers didn't really work for one particular employer, rather the community as a whole provided the labor necessary for the industry. The initial strategy was to confront growers directly through traditional labor tactics, work stoppages, strikes, pressure tactics of that sort. This was only marginally successful when you were trying to organize strikes among desperately poor workers. It doesn't take very long for the employers to figure out if they can hold out longer than the workers can. And that's what happened. And the strategy began to change in the early 2000s, and that's when the Coalition of Immokalee Workers really began to see themselves not as part of a discrete agricultural industry, but rather as part of a larger corporate supply chain. They framed their campaign for fair food in a human rights framework, and it has been extremely successful. So workers organizing themselves in a poor, isolated community, then building a bridge with consumers to bring pressure to bear on very recognizable brands. The first of which was Taco Bell. There was a 4-year boycott. Some of you veterans of the UT Austin scene may remember the protests that took place in our very own student union here. This took place around the country. A couple of dozen universities actually severed ties with Taco Bell. Faith groups got involved. Activist shareholders got involved. After 4 years, the company settled. Fast forward to 2016, and there are now 14 multi-billion-dollar brands that have committed, that have actually signed legally binding agreements with the CIW to be a part of the Fair Food Program. The program went operational in 2010 across the entirety, or the near entirety, of the Florida tomato industry. This is an industry with about 30,000 workers, and this past summer, we expanded outside of Florida to cover tomato farms during the summer season all the way up to New Jersey. We are now expanding into strawberries and bell peppers as well. So what are the key elements that have made this program successful? And these are some of the elements that we see as being key to this process of worker-driven social responsibility. So first, it would be worker leadership in drafting the standards of the program, the code of conduct in this case, as well as the program design and implementation. So not just that workers are at the table, as in many multi-stakeholder initiatives, but rather that workers are actually at the head of the table, because they are the actor in this equation with the most abiding interest in making sure that their human rights are no longer violated. The second would be a multi-layered monitoring process grounded in on-the-job worker education on their rights, and where workers become themselves the frontline defenders of protecting their own human rights. This is backed by a very rigorous auditing organization. In fact, the CIW set up its own monitoring organization, the Fair Food Standards Council, where I work, and 15 other people work, and we are the third party that monitors this industry. We go out and conduct audits. We also receive calls on the complaint line. So when workers call our 1-800 number, they're not getting a call center in India. They're speaking with auditors who have intimate knowledge of the industry, of the practices of the actors. It's quite a different model than most off-the-shelf monitoring. And perhaps most importantly of the elements is the idea of market enforcement. If there is anything to take away from this presentation, it's that standards are cheap. There's cheap as top. What makes things real, what changes people's lives, is actually enforcing those standards. If we simply enforced all the labor laws on the books in this country, it would radically change millions and millions of people's lives. Why should the discussion be any different in the context of human rights? So it's all about enforcement, and the way we do that is through the binding market agreements that we have with these 14 retailers. So if a grower gets, if there's a zero tolerance violation, such as forced labor on a farm, that's automatic suspension for a grower. That means they lose their ability to sell their product to those 14 multi-billion-dollar brands that we have legally binding agreements with. If there's a less serious violation and they refuse to correct that, then they could also be suspended. It's been extremely effective, and we can speak more about the metrics in a little while.
Thank you very much. Jessica.
Great. Thank you all, and it is particularly a pleasure to be here at UT Austin because we are very proud to have Texas as an affiliate of the WRC. As Charlie said, we're an independent worker rights monitor, and we have more than 180 university affiliates. And what that means in our case is that those affiliates have each adopted a code of conduct that governs the rights of workers in the supply chain for logo apparel. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Sean said, starting with the importance of legally binding agreements. And those codes of conduct, unlike many codes, are actually legally binding because they are built into the licensing agreements between licensee companies such as Nike and the Dallas Cowboys and universities. And so the WRC conducts investigations into the conditions at factories that produce that logo apparel and provide recommendations to schools about how licensees are measuring up. And obviously, as a powerhouse in sports and licensing apparel, Texas can play a huge role in really holding those companies accountable. So we're very glad to be able to work with folks here on that. I'm going to talk about the garment industry. And because there's been such an unusual level of consumer attention to worker rights in the garment industry, it's really been a petri dish for the past 20 years in experimenting with what works and what doesn't. So I'm going to start by talking about what hasn't worked, and then shift a little bit to one really exciting shift that's happened that I think shows how some of the same principles that Sean was talking about are also being experimented with in the garment sector, and showing what can really have a difference for workers and workplaces. Bangladesh really provides the clearest examples of dynamics in the garment sector right now, and particularly what's not working. As folks may know, over the past decade, some 2,000 workers have died in building fires and collapses. During the same period, apparel production in Bangladesh has boomed. It now has the biggest apparel export sector except for China. And global brands and retailers have chosen to source more and more apparel from Bangladesh, even though more than anywhere else in the world, workers are really risking their lives when they go to work in those buildings every day. And so when you look at the fact that at the same time that all this production is moving to Bangladesh, these same brands and retailers are claiming that they have a strong commitment to worker rights, you can see that there's a gap there between their rhetoric and what they're how they're actually making their sourcing decisions. And brands have been willing to pay for monitors, for audits, for hotlines, for multi-stakeholder initiatives, but they haven't really been willing to make the change that would be necessary to actually address the abuses. So to think about why that's happening, it's important to consider 4 features of how the supply chains work. First is that brands and retailers have chosen to contract out production. Very few of these brands and retailers actually own factories anymore. Second, they're signing only short-term contracts for specific orders with these factories. So they're constantly moving around the globe, and producers know that they can lose those contracts at any minute. Third, they limit their production to a small portion of each factory. So any given factory owner is having to deal with multiple brands at a time. And fourth, there are very low barriers to entry in garment, and there are a lot of people that really want jobs. So there's an oversupply of production capacity. So brands and retailers can really play different factories off against each other to push for lower prices and quicker turnaround. And so as a result, producers are under intense pressure to cut costs however they can, and unsurprisingly, that often includes trying to cut labor costs by paying sub-minimum wages, cutting corners on safety, and whatever else they can do. So what apparel brands and retailers have done is to notice that that creates reputational risk for them. They can be embarrassed. It doesn't look good when these terrible things happen. And so they've created monitoring that they can control that's not transparent or accountable, that enables them to then claim that they have programs to deal with this. And we can talk more about that later if it's of interest. But what's important to note is that all of the factories with mass fatalities in Bangladesh had been inspected by these brand auditors and by multi-stakeholder initiatives. And even after hundreds of workers had died, these inspections were not paying any attention to the structural and electrical issues that were actually resulting in these deaths. So I can talk, try to make it under my time. So I'm going to jump forward to the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Building Safety, which has been a real breakthrough over the past few years in Bangladesh. It is a fundamental departure from these voluntary initiatives in that it is a binding agreement between corporations and worker representatives that is enforceable through binding arbitration and requires the brands and retailers to pay whatever is necessary, probably hundreds of millions of dollars, to convert death traps into safe factories. It also requires the buyers to make commitments to keep producing in the factories where they are, as long as those factories remedy existing violations. The Accord is conducting independent fire and building safety inspections in every factory, which has never occurred before in many of these buildings. And they're also facilitating the process of creating occupational health and safety committees in these factories that have democratic worker representation. And overall, the Accord covers more than 1,700 factories and 2 million workers. I think there's a lot of work to do to see how the Accord is going to be implemented, and there are other features of its structure. But I think what's important to note is that the principles that were built into the Accord, the fact that it's legally binding, that it has transparent reporting, long-term purchasing agreements, and commitments particularly around pricing and funding to make sure that factory owners are actually getting the resources they need from brands, either through price adjustments or one-time payments, to make the changes that need to be made. Those are what we see as the principles that need to be in play for future efforts to make changes in this type of supply chain.
Thank you. So the other speakers in this panel have spoken about certification schemes in relation to forestry, food and the garment industry. And my contribution will look at the role of certification in the emerging market for carbon offsets. And many of the issues that I'll raise, particularly around the rights of Indigenous people and forest-dependent people, overlap lots of the comments that José has already made in relation to the Forest Stewardship Council. However, I also hope to touch on some broader issues about the role that certification has played in socially legitimating the commodification of carbon and the trade in carbon offsets, despite the many criticisms that such carbon trading schemes have attracted from climate justice activists and from climate justice social movements. So for those of you who don't know, carbon offsets credits are credits that claim to represent a reduction in or a saving of carbon dioxide somewhere else that can be purchased in order to compensate for emissions here. So they're a highly controversial and I think a very problematic commodity. And you might have come across these, like the offers to purchase an offset when you book a plane trip or a bus ticket. A couple of years ago there was controversy when the band Coldplay announced that their band would be carbon neutral. And then later there was an investigative journalist who found out that the mango plantations that had been planted in India had all subsequently died from lack of follow-up. So, unlike the other commodities that have been discussed here, because carbon offsets are intangible, For this reason, certification of offsets become almost mandatory in the voluntary market in order to have third-party verification that you're actually getting the savings that the credits purport to represent. And certification in this way is playing a really key role in the construction and the social legitimation of these markets. And there's been a whole proliferation of certification schemes that have come up in this area, and they all have their own specific speciality niche. So my main focus today will be looking at not so much certification schemes that look at the environmental integrity of offsets, but those that focus on the social impacts of carbon offsets. And these are arisen primarily in the context of afforestation, so tree planting projects, as well as projects to protect forests and avoid deforestation. And there's been a lot of contestation around these sort of projects, particularly because there's concern that they will affect the rights and livelihoods of approximately 1.6 billion people who live in and around forest areas or depend on forests to some degree for their livelihoods. Approximately 300 million of whom identify as Indigenous. So there's some certification schemes that have emerged to provide assurance that rights are being protected and benefits from such projects being equitably distributed. And the main ones are the climate, community and biodiversity standards that were established by 5 conservation organisations in 2005. It's since had 3 reiterations of these standards, and the RED Plus social and environmental standards that were launched in 2009. And these both have provisions for free, prior and informed consent, respect for land rights, and the equitable benefit sharing. However, amongst other things, these schemes have been critiqued for lacking clear definitions of what they mean by equitable and who they consider constituent parties in relation to this. And I'll just give some examples of some of the controversies that have arisen. So one case that's attracted a fair bit of attention is the Kokoda Forest Reserve in Uganda. And that's a commercial plantation project that's estimated hopes to sequester 200,000 tonnes of carbon, and it was certified by the first edition of the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Standards. But that certification has since expired. So the certification is always for 5-year periods, even though the projects often have a longer lifespan. And so the project promised that local communities will benefit from employment and from tree planting activities, but these benefits have only gone to to private landholders in the area, which is only 4% of the households in the area. The project also prevented a lot of the existing livelihood activities, such as cattle grazing, charcoal burning and firewood collection. But then when a lot of these issues are raised, the company says that they're just enforcing what the local law is at the time, that conducting these activities in the area is illegal under national law. Also, reviews found failure to properly address and understand how communities are affected, and the socio-economic baseline study was only completed 9 years after the project first began. Another project that's attracted controversy is the Ulo Mason project in Aceh in Indonesia that was started by Flora and Fauna International and Carbon Consortium, which was funded by Merrill Lynch. And that aimed to protect 750,000 hectares and save 3.4 million tonnes of CO2 over a 30-year period. And again, it was also verified by the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Standards in 2008, and that certification has again lapsed after that 5-year period. But then in May 2011, the East Asian Mineral Corporation bought half the shares in the carbon conservation because it wanted to open a 6,000 hectare gold mine right in the middle of that conservation area. With this sort of idea of, we'll sacrifice a bit in order to save the rest. And I think that example sort of speaks to some of the problematic political economy that these carbon offsets are often caught within, because they're often being used to legitimate the continued pollution that happens elsewhere. And so you have often very tense vested interests that are playing out within these projects. And you see a lot of these same tensions emerging in certification of these projects.
Great, thank you very much for these 5 initial presentations. There'll be plenty of time now to get deeper into a series of issues. Our plan was to leave about 45 minutes for all of you to participate, and we'll try to stick pretty much to that. I have a series of initial issues that I want to raise, and I want to also say that right at the very end, we'll give each panelist a chance to make a few concluding remarks in case there's something that you feel like you haven't been able to say in the course of the discussion.
And I do want to get fairly quickly to this question of whether we're actually talking about one coherent family of activities, or whether there are some really important distinctions that need to be drawn in this realm of certification. But before going there, one prior question for anyone to take up, if you're interested. I'm interested in understanding if there's a story that we need to understand a little bit better as to why this comes about when it does, kind of historically. Why does certification emerge, I guess, in the 90s in all these different realms as what Mike calls in his book a certification revolution, and as Sean alluded to, that comes at the heels of a sense of failure of other tactics, and there's various other specific stories that can be told. But what should we know about how to explain its emergence in historical moment that certification becomes an alternative political strategy? Are there deferrals? Is there a sense of abandonment of certain paths of social change in favor of others, or how do we account for its emergence? I'm not going to ask specific people unless no one wants to respond. So anyone who wants to jump in, including Mike, are you still there?
Charlie, happy to jump in.
Go for it.
I think there's a very simple answer, and that's social media. If we look at the ability of advocacy groups nationally and internationally to orchestrate, for example, simultaneous demonstrations in Europe, Malaysia, Chile, Russia, against a single company, it never could have happened before social media. So I believe that the ability of people to communicate through social media, which has expanded greatly over the last 15 to 20 years, both A, makes corporations incredibly sensitive to accusations that appear in social media, and B, gives power to civil society that we've never had before. You know, the nightmare of the marketing vice president of any major corporation now is to wake up in the morning and find that a significant accusation has been made on social media, and that it will affect the reputation of the company, the value of its stock, the price of its products, all on the basis of reasonably credible information distributed through social media. So I don't have much difficulty in seeing this as the thing which has changed the world from one which is corporate dominated to one in which we in the civil society have a better chance than ever to change the way corporations behave.
Add a couple of thoughts. I agree that the internet has played a critical role in probably most, if not all, of these endeavors. Certainly in the case study of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, I mean, the first website was crude, but it was up there in the late 90s, and it's gotten much better since then. Now it gets over 3 million hits a month, which is crazy when you think about a really impoverished community attacking that sort of online presence. Corporate executives look at it, media looks at it. It's not just activists. Part of the context as well that I think Jess mentioned is that there's been the globalization of production. There's been, the fissuring of the workplace, so to speak. The consolidation of power and wealth that's taken place at the top of these supply chains calls for some sort of redress, and there haven't been answers coming from traditional legal regulatory contexts. So when the Immokalee workers came out and said Taco Bell makes farm workers poor, that was more than just an analysis. It was also a call for a specific mechanism to transfer some economic resources from the top of that supply chain back down to the bottom. And then, of course, local political contexts vary as well. In Florida, Jeb Bush essentially dismantled the Department of Labor and refashioned it into the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. So the idea of waiting for some state inspectors to come and you know, sort of make everything okay never really came about. But it's also important to mention, I think, that you know, these codes of conduct often extend beyond the law. You get things through a code of conduct that go beyond a legal baseline. So it's really not just, you know, yes, we can enforce the law where previously the government couldn't, but we can also get things that the law never even required for, and that frankly would be difficult to achieve through lobbying in either Tallahassee or Washington, D.C.
I'll just make a couple of comments in relation to the carbon schemes. The certification comes about very much in the absence of any international regulation. So in relation to reducing emissions from deforestation and forest segregation, the question of social impact has come up again and again at UN climate meetings. And in 2010, the safeguards were articulated, and these include respect for Indigenous people's rights, recognising the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of, or noting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and engagement with all stakeholders. But in the 2013 RED framework, these just ask countries to address and respect these safeguards and to report on them. It doesn't require any international verification of compliance in the same way that international verification is required for the other technical elements of the program. So it's really in these gaps that you're sort of seeing a lot of certifications arising. And I think, you know, Jose might talk about this more. Forest Stewardship Council coming out of the valuable Forest Convention at the Rio Summit in 1992.
Yeah. Well, of course, there's many reasons that explain the emergence of these certification processes, but I would like to focus more on a perspective which I would call it perspective from the global south. And the fact is that although human rights violations in the context of business activities occur north and south, they're largely impact states and particularly disadvantaged communities in the global south. And there's an inability or lack of capacity of states in the global south to adjudicate these human rights violations. And moreover, there's these difficulties to adjudicate extraterritorial obligations of states when business based or domiciled in those states are committing human rights violations abroad. So this global dimension, to me, it's at the center of the notion of this certification process. Of course, social media makes business and states aware of the context of the problems, of the human rights problems that that extractive industries in particularly are generating. But it's human rights organizations, largely also business enterprises that realize that there should be other mechanisms in the absence of state and international mechanisms to adjudicate human rights violations in the context of the expansion of extractives.
Just to push it one step further, I think I heard a little bit in Sean's response, and I think in the case of the Mapuche in southern Chile would be another example where isn't there a sense in which some of the those labor laws that you referred to in your presentation, the responsibility of the state to protect workers' rights has sort of gets given up on in the process of a shift to an emphasis on certification? Or in the case of the Mapuche, there's a sense of the sort of radical inability of the state to really address basic major conflicts between forest companies and Mapuche communities, so that some kind of new approach is necessary, which also involves in some way a recognition that the state is incapable of doing its job. Is that part of what's going on?
Charlie?
Yes.
Let me respond partially to that. I agree with what Jose was saying, but I think that you asked two different questions. One is, do international certification systems provide a court of appeal which goes beyond national regulations? And the answer to that question is yes. If international labor standards, when applied to Chile, are not being abided by the companies in Chile, and then that raises the possibility that a condemnation of those companies can take place and their market position can be endangered. But the second side of that has to do with the legitimate claims of the Mapuche people. I believe that one of the problems that we have in these international certification systems, and particularly in FSC as applied in Chile, is that FSC starts out in its first principle with demonstrating obedience to the laws of the nation. But if the law of the nation does not concord with the aspirations of the Mapuche people to recover their traditional lands, it's very difficult for the FSC to say, the law says these companies have a right to plant plantations and to log in areas that have been traditional Mapuche lands. And our ability to support the aspirations of the Mapuche people to reclaim large tracts of Chilean land that have been taken from them under Chilean law, yes, law of the dictatorship, yes, law subsequent to that, is very limited. And so I think we have two different things here about the existence of an international court of appeals for labor standards and the problem of having the FSC, for example, fulfill all of the aspirations of all of the indigenous peoples that have existed for not decades, but almost a century.
Yeah, I think another piece of this is that these certification schemes did grow up in a time, in this period of globalization, when states were showing that the infrastructure of globalization, like the World Trade Organization and these other venues, were committed to protecting investor rights, but we're not committed to protecting worker rights in the same way. And so, ideally, and something José has worked on much more than I have, it would be better, I think, to not totally yield this space and have some type of binding conventions, laws, more traditional instruments that are governing what's happening. And I think similarly, it's important for folks on the ground in different places to continue to push their governments to actually protect their rights here and abroad. But at the same time, there is this huge gap that I think people were really seeing as starting in the late 90s, as people in this country became much more aware of how much production had been outsourced or offshored, and the inadequacy of measures to control that. And I think in labor, as in the environment, governments are often in much the same role as sort of the supplier factories that I talked about, in that they also see themselves as competing for investment. And so it can be very politically difficult to erect protections for workers that may also be disincentivizing investment. And so it's important, I think, to keep fighting in both venues. But, yeah.
I mean, one could argue, at least in the context of U.S. farm workers, that the abandonment took place when Reconstruction. How far back do we want to go? It was reinforced when farm workers were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act during the New Deal, an exclusion that remains on the books this very day. Farm workers weren't covered by minimum wage laws in the 1960s. So, in the farm worker advocacy community, there's long been a push, and frankly, a largely ineffective push, to get those things changed. So, it becomes a question, it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but there's also just some very real practical considerations. When you're a poor community and you want to figure out how to get your rights respected, and you have very finite resources with which to do that, you're going to focus on the thing you think represents the best shot at work. And so, who here has filed some kind of administrative complaint, either with, we're in a law school, with Department of Labor or OSHA? Does anybody here have any experience with that? How long
No resolution yet.
So we've resolved 1,200 cases to date in the Fair Food Program that have come to us through our hotline, just in 4 years. And these metrics here show that 80% of those cases we were able to resolve in less than a month. You know, I mean, that's efficacy. And that's the power that we've been able to build with this system. So it's not that, you know, DOL still exists, and with, you know, their 900 wage and hour inspectors across the country. We're not stopping them from coming on Fair Food Program farms. But there's some really severe limitations to just sitting around hoping that with a reinvigorated kind of new deal that will come in and transform farmers' lives.
Well, maybe to mention, yes, that there is, of course, there's lack of local mechanisms to adjudicate human rights. There's lack of local standards, and in the context of the Mapuche, and I referred briefly in my introduction, what strikes me is the fact that a 2.8 million hectares project has not been assessed environmentally. So that talks of the shortcomings of that legislation. But there's this lack of adjudication mechanisms at the international level, and probably that's what explains the emergence of as Julie was saying, of the FSC after the Rio Summit in 1992. So as you know, there's this whole debate on building international instruments that allow the adjudication of human rights violation, particularly those committed by transnational corporations. But this is a process that has been going on since the 90s with different initiatives at the human rights at the United Nations level, and have never been really moved forward due to opposition from states that generally where corporations are based. But I just wanted to make a final argument to make it more complex, that I do not agree that the certification mechanisms, at least the FFC, is an adequate court of appeals for to adjudicate human rights violations committed in the context of forest activities. I mean, I didn't have the time to talk about the findings of this research project that's led by Charles Hale and our team. But basically, we have realized that our main finding is that that the certification process has not been a process that allows to monitor and to ensure that forest corporations in their certification process respect human rights standards. A final comment on the short, the restrictive reading of FSC standards, and many of these standards by corporations, because these standards rely not only on domestic legislation, but also on international human rights legislation. And on many occasions, the reading of the implications of human rights international conventions is restrictive and does not acknowledge, for instance, customary rights to property by indigenous peoples. So I disagree with this idea that this FSC at least is a valid court of appeal to adjudicate human rights violations committed in the context of forest activities.
That's perhaps a segue into one more one more question before I open it up to all of you. So we talk about certification regimes, or other terms have been used, and there's actually a wide range of different kinds of mechanisms. I think multiple stakeholders was one that was used, worker controlled or worker driven. There's also, I know there's certification when those of you that those of us who still frequent Starbucks have the the affirmation of conscious that there is a certification going on in Starbucks coffee, but it's actually a subsidiary of Starbucks is doing the certification. So we have a whole range of different, and then there's NGOs that are sort of an intermediary body that do the certification. So there's, I'm not sure I have all the characterizations correct, but there's a whole range. And the question is, what are the, should we be talking about these as all sort of variants of a sort of a broadly, loosely unified political strategy, philosophy approach, or are there really important distinctions that need to be made in terms of efficacy, outcome, shared political values, et cetera?
I guess some very general comments on that. So there was a time when I asked a question like certification schemes are often seen as part of a shift from government to governance, and to much more neoliberal forms of governance, of voluntarilist governance and substantive brands that are competing with one another in a market. But I think it's important to look at certification as a very contested field, and in which there's contests are taking place about whether it's citizens' control over corporate activities or whether it becomes about corporate self-regulation and the co-option of NGOs in these sort of processes. And those struggles are really taking place within certification schemes. And I think the questions of power and authority really come in there, and the questions that Sean raised about who sets the standards, who decides the standards, who adjudicates the standards, who determines whether standards have been breached, become the key question about who's being empowered or disempowered in those schemes. I think they're the questions that might really help us differentiate between whether we're seeing a shift towards much more corporate forms of neoliberal self-regulation, or whether we're seeing a push towards maybe an expanded social contract that brings in the people that were excluded from a lot of these social democratic protections.
Do you want to be a little more concrete? Just to kind of.
Very vague, but
No. I mean,
can help concretize
no.
it.
In terms of just giving examples of maybe one and the other. You gave a nice dichotomy, but I wasn't sure whether is there an example of one versus the other that you want to.
Well, I think that sort of example that you gave of like Starbucks starting up their own certification scheme. I think McDonald's started up their own certification scheme for coffee. That came into conflict with other schemes. Is a clear example of that sort of corporate greenwashing or social responsibility, washing, so to speak. Whereas I think some of the stuff that Jessica and Sean in particular are talking about are examples that are really trying to push in a different direction.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's a very, very, very contested space. It's easy to call out things on the extreme, right? It's easy to put the Fair Food Program next to Starbucks, proprietary certification regime, and be like, these two things are clearly different. That's easy, right? The origins tell you all you need to know. One came from Starbucks, the other came from a worker community. And there's other elements that you could point to as well. Where this conversation, gets difficult is in the middle of the spectrum, because you have instances in which, these multi-stakeholder initiatives, many of them, and that even, is kind of a diverse outcome of things, but you could have an instance where NGOs who are frankly interested in projecting their brand and attaining relevance and being part of the conversation are eager and willing to be a part of a scheme that is essentially a corporate-controlled scheme, one that's not actually about redistributing power. I mean, the 14 agreements that the CIW achieved, those were sweetheart deals cut with corporations. It took 4 years of protest to convince, 4 years out of all of our lives, to convince talk about to go along with this thing. Another 10 years for the other 13. That's very different than a backroom deal where the company convenes a meeting and there are some NGOs that have a nice brand, and now all of a sudden it's very friendly, consumers feel good, and nothing's changed. And it's really an extension of corporate marketing. So we can have this conversation, but it's going to get uncomfortable, and people have to be willing to go there. It means calling out organizations that may have had a proud history at one point, but have now lost their way and are doing things that aren't actually advancing the interests of workers or people's human rights. So, stir in the pot.
Right, that's my job.
Yeah.
Charlie.
ahead, and then Jessica wanted to speak. Would you like to hear Mike, or would you like to go
Sure,
first?
no, go, yeah.
Okay, Mike, you're on.
Very quickly. I agree with Sean in principle, but I think if you want a direct answer and an answer to consumers as to what to do, here I am, the academic activist in his 70s, probably older than anybody else in that room. But my response is click through it. You know, if you see Starbucks cafe standards listed as the standard, look it up on the internet, click through it, and find out who supports it. And it wouldn't take long to find out that it's Standards' home-based brand that has virtually no significant NGO behind it. Sean is right in saying that in the fair trade world, there is contention, there's competition about who is corporate, who's dominated by the corporations and who is not. I would agree with him completely that CIW has the cleanest record of all the people working in the agricultural field within the U.S. But basically speaking, there are hundreds of very successful certification schemes out there. And every successful one creates an industry-based imitation. So in the case of the workers' rights consortiums, Jessica knows very well that the Fair Labor Association is their biggest competitor, unfortunately sponsored by and supported by the Clinton administration a number of years ago. But it is an industry-based labor standard for garments. And the Workers' Rights Consortium, if you click through to it, you will see the kind of NGO support that they have that FLA does not have. So you can figure this out, but it is a contested space, and it's not easy.
Jessica.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Sean was saying about how to identify these groups, which I think is very good advice, there's also the question of do these certification standards actually require the companies to do the hard work that they're trying to avoid doing? And so some pieces of that are being genuinely transparent about the supply chain. You know, for example, there's a, you know, publishing in the apparel industry, there was 20 years ago, there was a major victory of just getting a number of apparel companies, and particularly in the collegiate sector, to publish their locations online and make it clear where the work is happening. But also the transparency of when investigations are done, is that information public? And I think a hallmark of a lot of these private certification schemes is that they'll do as many audits as you want them to do, but they're not going to share that information. And so you'll never know what problems were found and whether they were fixed. And that was particularly clear in this Bangladesh example, where brands had gone in, done audits, found that a factory was not up to their standards, and left. So then you still have workers working in a dramatically unsafe factory that has been repeatedly audited and shown to be unsafe, but that information has never been shared with workers or the public. So that kind of transparency is key. And I think really, again, as Sean said, where the rubber meets the road is really the question of enforcement, and one piece of that is having agreements that are legally binding. And with the Bangladesh Accord, that was really the biggest obstacle to getting brands and retailers to sign on, was that they were willing to sign on to codes that required all kinds of beautiful things, but when you ask them to actually make a legally binding commitment to live by what they had signed, that's when they were like, oh, that exposes us to all kinds of liability, we could never do that. And it became clear that they were used to signing on to things and not having to enforce them. And so I think looking for agreements that are legally binding, that have workers at the table, and that really do the hard work of, for example, forcing the companies to think about how they're doing sourcing. So making longer term agreements with particular suppliers, or consolidating production in a way that enables them to actually have the sway at particular producers to make change. I think that's an important piece.
Yeah. I think that Julia made a really good classification of who drives this certification process. And I was thinking in the example, again, of Chile and the forest industry. It might be interesting to say that initially these corporations found their own certification process, homemade by them. It's called Certificado Forestal. But with time, they realized they couldn't get into global markets with that label. So that's when they realized that they had to become a part of these multi-stakeholder holder initiative, the FSC. And of course, it's an improvement, and the participation of different chambers, different perspectives, the economic, the social, and the environmental, it's a progress. However, this complaint by the Mapuche in the context of forest industry, specifically because they do not have a say in the process of certification, and that's one of our main findings. And it might be interesting reading comparative experiences. For instance, a Canadian FSC developed a fourth chamber, which is an indigenous chamber, which is part of the FSC along with the other three chambers, and has a relevant role in deciding in the certification process. And it also has resulted, for instance, in some suspensions of certificates of large corporations, forest corporations operating in indigenous land, unlike what has happened in Chile. But going back to insisting that this should not preclude the state's responsibility, and state legislation and state policies and state grievance mechanism that are in the end should exist to adjudicate these human rights violations. And finally, relevant to mention that the international debate on the need for international mechanisms that allow for the adjudication of human rights violations. Probably, well, this proposal of a binding convention at the UN system is quite relevant. It deals with transnational corporations, but thinking of the Inter-American human rights system, it has been for years a space where many of human rights violations committed by business activities has been adjudicated. And perhaps that's, at least in my opinion, the crisis of the Inter-American human rights system is very closely related to the setting of standards for business, for state responsibility with regards to business activities which result in human rights violations.
Just to quickly jump in again, I think another issue is like the question of who's auditing the auditors, and what other conflicts of interest that some of the auditors might be under. And in the forest carbon schemes that I was talking about, they're using a lot of the same auditors as the clean development mechanism for carbon offsets, and they're also using a lot of the same auditors as the FSC or the roundtable for sustainable palm oil. And a lot of these auditing companies, such as SGSSA, which is Swiss-based, or SCS Global Services, which is US-based, themselves large for-profit companies. And there's now like an international accreditation for accreditation schemes. But there's also been a lot of reports by NGOs pointing to conflicts of interest that these companies have because they're often being paid in ongoing way by the same companies. Or like a recent sort of report about the roundtable for sustainable palm oil, NGOs who saying who's watching the watchman, saying there's not enough accountability of the conflicts of interest these auditors themselves might have.
Good. Well, there's another couple rounds on this question, I'm sure. But I want to recognize the patience of the audience and open up to get some contributions from you all to provoke the panel further. I see Willie and Dave there. Willie?
So it's a great panel, and it's a great subject, questions and differences and similarities, but there's something nagging at me about the stories, and this is the Workers' Rights Consortium, the amount of workers. It cannot be the case that the motley machinery emerged out of the community of poor workers, just as much as I understand that trope being a vivid one. I don't think. In other words, I'm curious about two things, sort of the institutional mechanisms that explain these, singular success stories. I'm sure you all thought a lot about it. Why can't you know, what is it, what are the problems? What is it about the political economy of this particular set of agricultural workers that lent itself to such a smashing success? You know, whether it's the small number of large corporations, I mean, I'm sure you all have a story there. And what were the critical insights and players that enabled a community of poor farm workers to have this kind of astonishing success? What kinds of skills were brought to the table? And what are the impediments? If all it takes is the aspirations of poor farm workers, one would expect it to reproduce itself swiftly across the whole agricultural system.
That's a very good question. This mic. It's a very good question, and it really gets to the heart of the replicability of this success story, because and it's something, you know, we're thinking about a lot. So there's a group currently in Vermont called Migrant Justice, a pretty new organization, and they're a young group. It's dairy farm workers in Vermont, and they are embarking on this path of replicating the Fair Food Program in their context. They have the benefit of basically 20 years of experience that they can glean from the CIW. So part of the answer is that it's not going to always be necessary to have all of the same exact ingredients that came together in a Immokalee work. You're going to need some of those components, but in some ways the story of the CIW is probably lightning in a bottle. I mean, they caught something, and they came together in a way that worked for that community, whereas previous efforts really hadn't. They were able to connect with students across the country at a point in time when there was a lot of heightened consciousness about sweatshop conditions and sort of what's behind the brand. And some of that was just timing. They've benefited from having a group of a leadership group within the organization that has stayed there for the long run. There hasn't been a lot of turnover. So those things are all in their corner. You know, would I hold my breath and expect that particular story to reproduce itself in, you know, agricultural context X tomorrow? No, I wouldn't. But like I said, I don't think it really has to now that these kind of the path forward has been blazed in some way and a model has been forged. So really then the discussion becomes, well, what do you need, given that there is a formula now for this new model, what are the elements required for that? And that's why I think the experience in Vermont will be very instructive. And they're in ongoing negotiations with Ben and Jerry's, and you know there should be some developments there soon. And so everyone should keep their eyes on that and see how that effort at replication works. So, I don't know if that got it. There were a lot of threads to your question, but
I remember reading in an MA thesis that there was a lot of really interesting transnational kind of worker empowerment ideas flowing between Immokalee and various places in Latin America. Is that
yeah.
You didn't mention that, but I wondered if that's part of the answer.
No, absolutely. When the CIW began, more than anything, it was the influence of a lot of Haitian peasant animators, kind of out of a liberation theology influenced movement in the 1980s, who were very active in the early days of the CIW. And so those kind of techniques, the ideas of leadership development, of popular education, that was really the orientation or the framework of the group. And you know, that really does, if you spend any amount of time in Immokalee, you see that those elements are still very much at the heart of a lot of its day-to-day activities. You know, they have 4 weekly meetings every week. There's a women's group, there's the free Saturday Cine, there's a Wednesday membership meeting, low power radio station, but the idea is basically just the constant raising of consciousness, and it's very participatory and gives people a chance to be involved. So while it's true that there have been other people involved in this process, what has been the driving engine the entire time has been that participation at the community level.
David and Peter, and then like Dan, if others want to get a question in, just signal. David.
So I had a question about this notion of how this is a contested space. And it really goes to the model that's being used. You guys have actually talked a lot about the impacts on business reputations. There are kind of 2
Use the mic, Dave, because just make sure that the
There
mic.
are two ways in which it actually seems to occur. It's direct consumer choice and just providing information to them so they can make decisions that are consistent with their values. And then there's the reputational threats that you guys have really kind of emphasized here. And I'm wondering how important you think the former is relative to the latter. And then also, for both of them, how important you have this sort of tension between third-party independent certification and then a lot of more industry-dominated, either multi-party or individual private labels going on. And so you want to put pressure on the industry. There's always the option for them to kind of opt out of these programs, and how much that is a factor in sort of thinking about strategizing use of certification.
Charlie?
Go for it.
Great question. Absolutely essential question. The FSC has now completed 20 years since its founding in 1994. And we are conscious of the fact that the majority of the adherents to FSC, by the companies that now have more than 30,000 certificates in 80 countries around the world, comes from B2B, that is, reputational risks between the forestry product companies, the forest product processing companies, and the companies that sell to final consumers. We don't have very great final consumer recognition of what we do. So for us at least, the reputational risk to companies of having major advocacy groups come down on them for their practices that don't meet FSC standards is the most important driving force. Now, FSC has the advantage of having about 140 of the world's strongest environmental and social advocacy groups supporting FSC as the key solution to sustainable forest management into the future. That doesn't mean that in my closing comments, I won't be able to respond better to what José Aylwin was saying about the specifics of the situation in Chile. I think it's very clear that most of this so far has been driven by business-to-business reputational risk, with companies responding to the advocacy campaigns of major NGOs around the world, from Greenpeace to WWF to Friends of the Earth to local groups across the United States and across other countries around the world.
Anyone else want to add another one? We get another.
I would agree that I think reputational risk overall, as opposed to individual consumer choices, is the way to really have, is the thing that the companies are really looking at. And I think that for us, the universities have played a really key role in that. And the fact that universities in the apparel sector play a role not only as, that the role of universities as licensors means that, first of all, when the WRC releases a report and universities choose to act on that report, it has a direct impact on those companies' bottom line. Because, for example, in the case of Nike in 2010 or Russell Athletic in 2009, or VF more recently, when students and universities have looked at these WRC reports and decide that certain companies should no longer be able to produce university logo apparel, then that's losing a share of the marketplace for those companies, and that has a really direct impact. But it also is really amplified by that reputational impact, because there are then articles and stories and a generation of students that are seeing a brand in a certain way. And so I think where you can really have an impact, whereas going through individual consumers and expecting each individual choice to add up, I think it takes a long time to add up the amount of money that is necessary. The reputational risk is really what can move things. And I think I think it's totally true that in each of these cases, it's very important when students or other or farm workers or whoever it is are pushing for a certain solution, it's important to be really clear about what that solution is, and whether it's the WRC, whether it's the FFSC, because there is always going to be that competition, and that fight over who is seen as legitimate is, I think, where where that tension really happens. It's been interesting for us in Europe that labor unions are seen as much more important as legitimators. And so in the United States, there is an alternative industry-driven organization in Bangladesh called the Alliance. And it was founded by apparel companies. It's never had any union participation. And that was really not a problem for the US apparel companies. But in Europe, people looked at it and said, well, that doesn't look right. You know, that doesn't look like it's going to solve our problem. And so the fact that labor unions were a voice had a really big impact. So that's been an interesting distinction to observe.
I would just add that, can I borrow your mic?
Oh, yeah.
We're down the mic.
Okay.
I would just add that what, from our perspective at least, in this somewhat, oh, there he is again, speaks to your earlier question. Nice timing. What helps drive the concern around reputational risk is just nonstop organizing, because you can't really just rely, the media is fickle, so you can't rely on, you know, there just to be unending exposés on, you know, this particular human rights crisis to drive corporate action. You know, part of the Immokalee machinery, as you described it, is a standalone organization called the Student Farm Worker Alliance. And they exist to do nothing but organize students around the campaign and to drive that, you know. So there are different elements to this. But if it wasn't for, you know, and there's a similar organization that does that with people of faith in churches, right? And if it wasn't for those particular components, you know, an article on a slavery case comes out, but it's a flash in the pan. You have to have something that's pushing it, and that's, you know, we say that we use the role of, it's not that consumers monitor human rights, it's that consumers can play a role in bringing pressure to bear on corporations, who then can allow workers to monitor their own human rights. So it doesn't work really for the title of a panel, but that's actually how it works.
Peter, please. Oh, sorry. Do you want to respond?
Sorry, quickly jump in to say that different actors within a supply chain would be differently susceptible to this sort of reputational risk as well. So, for example, when Asia Pulp and Paper was accused of a lot of illegal logging, NGOs didn't really target them, but they targeted the people who were buying their products. And in one case, it was Martell, the company that makes Barbie, that pressure got placed on them. Or similarly with a lot of the palm oil, it's not the palm oil companies that are being pressured, but brands like Kit Kat that are buying them. And so I think there's a fair bit of strategy that needs to go into identifying who's more susceptible to that sort of reputational risk within a particular supply chain.
And Charlie, just to build on that, very quick story. AP&P was the first company that FSC used the nuclear option to disassociate themselves completely from the FSC. AP&P first responded, well, we don't care. We don't need you. Now, 7 years later, they are very, very interested in getting back into the FSC family, and there is a very complicated negotiation process underway in which they're going to have to meet some very stringent conditions in order to get back into the FSC world. So it reinforces what Julia was saying.
Thank you, Charlie. First of all, congratulations not only to the presentation but to the work on the ground and internationally that you're doing, extremely important. We have here global industries. We've got hydrocarbons, we've got food, we've got forestry, we've got apparel, and these, the movement, the name and shame movement and the market movement really relies on a receptive audience. And the receptive audience is in Europe and in the United States, so there's an education element of that which responds, which bounces off a set of values in those societies which is sympathetic to human rights, environmental responsibility, and so forth. But what about the domestic side? If you take, for example, Chile. I mean, Chile, if you say all of its products which are susceptible to this movement, the exported product, that's 34% of GDP. Bangladesh, it's only 14%. So that means there's 76% or 86% of the economy which is not being affected by the movements. And a lot of people employed. Let me give you two examples. I worked in the United Arab Emirates, heading an organization, and we had 4 brokered workers for the kitchen and 4 brokered workers for sort of the administrative staff. In an organization about 120, we learned that the 4 for one company did not have any health cover, whereas they're supposed to have health cover.
When we brought this attention to the Emirati managers, they said, that's not a problem. Just get rid of them, and we'll just take all 8 from the other company. I said, well, that's certainly not going to solve their problem. Well, we went through an iterative process. In the end, we said we were going to denounce the company, the brokerage company. I was warned that it was probably owned by a member of the royal family. We were going to get in deep trouble. We decided to go ahead anyway. The company said, oh, don't do anything. Don't do anything. Give us a month. In a month, they came in with 3,000 health certificates for all their other brokered workers. The key issue here is that the Emirati manager said, forget about it. I've recently been working with the ILO on forced labor in Brazil and Peru and child labor in Jordan. You go to the major companies in Peru and you say, you should be fighting forced labor. We don't use forced labor. Your supply chain does use forced labor. That's not our problem. That's the government's problem, as Jose was saying. In Jordan, you have a similar situation whereby child labor is absolutely key to the refugee population. The parents cannot work. So you have a sort of a very locked-in, difficult, complicated situation to combating child labor. My question, however, is this. The certification process is international. Should the certification process be focusing more attention on these local economies, devise subsidiaries who are working to have the same name and shame and legal action, if necessary, locally to cover, let's say, the 86% of the population or the 76% of the population?
I do work in the domestic context. Florida is strange, but it is part of the U.S. So, yeah, that's my witty answer. All right.
Again, too, like carbon offsets are effectively produced in the global south for purchase by companies in the global north who are trying to avoid making the emission cuts they should be making domestically, as sort of a way of deflecting that responsibility. So again, the structure of that economy means that that question doesn't really apply so much. I'll hand it over.
Perhaps some reflections to your question. I don't know if I'm going to answer it, but first of all, I would say that human rights awareness and environmental awareness is for good. It's not only an awareness that prevails in North America and Europe. It's interesting. Brazil has a huge environmental movement and human rights movement. The Andean countries also have had very strong movements in opposition, particularly against mining. In the context of Chile, coal power has had a huge resistance, and hydro dams have had a huge resistance by local communities that are impacted. Perhaps the forest plantations is a reality that has not been, it has not generated the awareness that other environmental and social conflicts have arisen. And maybe that's due to the centralized nature of some states, such as Chile, where I mean, these human rights organizations are based largely in capitals, and also it has to do with the lack of power of the voice of indigenous peoples, or how little it's being heard by dominant, by larger societies. That's on the one hand. Regarding, there's another specificity of the forest industry in the context of Chile, which is it's largely owned by Chilean corporations, which makes it more complex in terms of generating awareness in other places of the world. However, there's been, even in the context of the forest certification process, there was a campaign in the early 2000s against the export of forest products to the U.S. markets, which was organized along by Chilean environmental rights organizations with Forest Ethics, which is a US-based organization, and it was based on the problem of clear cutting and on the problem of substitution. So I don't know if these reflections will respond to your question, but there is an awareness which is not only characteristic of the US and Europe, but obviously this connection to consumers or to human rights activists in this context can help to confront these activities.
Charlie, I'd like to build on what Jose just said.
Mike, we're kind of dealing with a time issue. Would you hold it against me if I cut you off?
Not at all.
I want to.
Go ahead.
There's three people that still have asked to speak, and we want to make sure and give some time for the panelists to conclude. And with three more questions, we're going to be running against our time. So why don't we get those the questions and then make sure that you get a chance at the end to come back to this topic if need be. But Dan, Ariel, and Karen all wanted to speak. Dan.
Thanks. Most of my question, I think, has already been taken care of. David asked essentially what I was going to ask, but I thought maybe we could go a little bit deeper and do the sort of comparative analysis a little bit. It seems that one of the things that, so, you know, you sometimes present this whole model as if the real engine driving it are individual consumer decisions. You know, the mean Taco Bell consuming person wants fair tomatoes in their taco. It seems like the mechanism is much more driven by the sort of overall corporate identity and reputation of the retailer maybe, but the consumers are more in the background. But it strikes me that in the two movements that seem really vibrant and effective, there's a pretty close connection between a sort of organized workers and a really easily mobilizable base of activists and individual consumers, right, which doesn't seem to be present in the Mapuche case, right? The Mapuche, they're really far away. We don't know that much about them over here. College students don't buy a lot of lumber, you know, and that sort of thing, right? And so it seems like that's the sort of thing that's missing, right? It seems like the politics that drives the effectiveness of the program seems to be something like a connection between the workers and their ability to sort of get in with a base of mobilizable people who care and who are willing to boycott and protest and do that sort of thing. And you know, I just wonder if that's sort of reflects your reality and how that could be translated into, you know, movements like carbon or forestry, which seem not very easily to lend themselves to that.
Should we get all three questions?
Why don't we get all three and see if they relate to one another? And if not, we'll try to address all of them.
Okay. Well, it turns out that mine has a follow-up to that, because I was thinking too that there was just a mismatch, and another way in which there is one is that the Mapuche are trying to stop production, right? They're not the owners of they're not the producers in the way that they are in the other examples. So that took me to thinking, and maybe this will be a chance for Jose and Michael to have their final words on it, but you know, we were kind of, if you take Julia's dichotomy, then the FSC, I gather, fell into the expanded social contract side of things, and yet Jose's telling us that the Mapuche have a complaint before the FSC. So we kind of, Sean talked about people bringing complaints and resolving them, but we sort of skipped over that adjudicatory phase. So what happens when you're in front of a certification body that you think is basically certainly not the self-regulation, and you lose? And I don't know what's happened in the Mapuche claim, but I was really struck by the difference between Jose and Michael on this, which was partly a question of law, right? I mean, it was a question of interpretation of law. So when the FSC says we're not changing, we have to defer to local law, you might think, oh, that's really bad. But also, Jose can come up with arguments about why local law is not what one of the members undoubtedly, or what the FSC might come up with thinking it is, either by talking about international law or having a different interpretation. So there's a way in which, at that adjudicative stage, I kind of wonder, and maybe I'll put this as a question for Jose in a way, how does that compare to other kinds of lawyering you do, and what might be the possibilities and limits of getting a, almost a quasi-legal decision about the status of the Mapuche? What might be some of the effects of that? How might that hinder your lawyering?
I don't know if I have questions or more comments. One is, where do you place China in this whole picture? Because you can be really good at making pressure here in the US or in Europe, but then the Chinese mining companies will come and will say, we don't care, and you can have all the certification processes that you want, but the Chinese will be extracting without respecting any environmental standards or labor standards or anything. So how your certification process works in the whole global economy. And the second is, I see a very piecemeal approach. This one sector of the industry in one country or one industry a whole, but does not address the structural inequality problems within the country, within the global market, even within the same industry. So, and that in part goes to José's point about do not forget the human rights regime at all. Do not forget about the role of the state. And it appears that the certification process in many ways keeps undermining the importance of the state as protecting and guaranteeing rights. And I would like to hear more about that you are circumventing the weak state or an unwilling state, but what happens with the 76% of the economy that is not covered by these certification processes? You want to
I'll jump in about Ariel's question about the role of the state. I think we can't look at certification schemes as separate, almost, well, they are separate, but we need to look at them as layered on top of state and international regulation that's already existing. Like a lot of these schemes are referring to international law, but then also, particularly in the forestry context, where a lot of the places, like Indonesia is a country where I've got the most familiarity with these issues, the rights aren't being protected in domestic law. And so then even if concession holders try and negotiate with communities, they do so in the shadow of the law, where communities have very few rights. And so you hear reports where, communities might be prepared to settle for what they can get, which might be a little bit better than what they'd otherwise get, but maybe not everything that you'd really think they deserve in that sense. And so national law still plays a really big role in a way of constructing the framework in which consultation happens as required by a lot of these certification schemes, if that makes sense. And I think just with the reputational risks, one to say too, like a lot of these certification schemes operate as brands in the market and they are themselves subject to reputational risk. But also to reiterate again the point that's been made about how much work it takes to create reputational risk and how much work goes into sort of creating, the stakeholder, consumer, activist, citizen. And that, again, that's a question that a lot of, environmental NGOs are asking themselves. Is this the work they should be doing, or is there to make these schemes work, or is there other things that maybe their energies are better directed towards?
We did speak earlier on the role of the state, and I think I'll sort of leave it at that for now. The progress is incremental, and that can be very frustrating, especially when you are acutely aware of the scope of these human rights crises. I'm not sure what the alternative really is in many instances. In a vacuum, yeah, it's incremental, but social change often is. In terms of Karen's question, I didn't really get into the technical nuts and bolts of how we adjudicate things in the Fair Food Program, but just to be clear, the Fair Food Standards Council, which is the monitoring group created by the CIW, right, so the CIW's own monitoring group, is the fact-finding body in the Fair Food Program. So if we go out and say a crew leader was sexually harassing a worker, that that is final. Now the growers can appeal that, and the most recent wrinkle is that there is a binding arbitration process. And so that's actually advantageous. It keeps it out of the courts, which are not historically, extremely friendly to the advancing the interest of low-wage workers when they're being litigated by large corporations. And it maintains sort of the efficacy and speed of remedy that we want to establish within the program. So there haven't been any appeals to date, remarkably. So every time the Fair Food Standards Council has made a finding, that's been accepted, and then corrective action plans are negotiated. But actually, the way the contracts are written with the brands, the CIW could be the monitoring organization. They just chose to create the Fair Food Standards Council to have that division of labor.
Well, several issues that were raised, and there's little time to address them, but perhaps I should mention that Mapuche people's strategy goes far beyond complaints to the FSC system, and this is perhaps one of the less visible actions that they undertake. And although, as Dan said, it is true that wood is not a product that sensitive sectors of society generally buy, the Mapuche have mobilized basically and have protested, ranging from peaceful demonstrations in the 90s to a more and more violent cycle in which the state is involved. So, I mean, just to talk about the Chilean context, is the so-called Mapuche conflict, which is not the Mapuche conflict. Of course, it's a Chilean conflict with those who lived there before. Is the main social conflict existing in the country today, 25 years after the recovery of democracy. So, so the way of calling the attention of society becomes more and more political and more through mobilization with this dimension of peaceful protest, but also violence. Their argument is that expansion of forest industry into their territory has generated violence, has generated poverty, migration, devastation of ecosystems. Regarding Karen's question on what other avenues or how to achieve justice, Convention 169, and this comes back to domestic legislation, but also to the relevance of international legislation, has made a big shift in extractives, in business activities since 2009. The litigation, particularly dealing with the right to consultation on the basis of Convention 169, has been steadily increasing and has been successful. Several projects, including a pulp mill, have been suspended on the basis of the lack of consultation. But moreover, this leads to other debates of a new social agreement, of a new constitution, where the rights of the indigenous peoples in this case are recognized, and the rights over lands and the right to define our own priorities in development. So definitely the complaint against the FSC is not the main strategy, and it's related to many other strategies that put the focus on domestic legislation and in the application of global standards into the domestic arena. Finally, a comment on China. It's a really relevant question because Arauco, which owns 1 million hectares of these 2.8 million hectares, is the first larger exporter worldwide of paper pulp to China. And this is facilitated by free trade agreements, where Chile has a leading role in these free trade agreements and in this other area of law, which is commercial law, which brings us to TPP and the relevance of this signing of TPP, although China is not part of it. But free trade agreements open these markets, and of course there is a challenge there, how to impact on states where human rights is not a priority. I would leave it there because of time.
Thanks. I'm also going to focus on Karen's question about adjudication, which I think is really crucial. And I think the way that what's being experimented with in the Bangladesh Accord is that, again, the way the Accord is structured is it's a binding agreement between workers represented by unions and companies, and similarly to the CIW process, the ultimate remedy or the ultimate adjudication forum is binding arbitration. And so there are a number of cases currently working their way through the internal system, and we'll have to see what happens when the unions decide whether to take those cases to an arbitrator and try to resolve them that way. And I think it is really important to have that kind of genuine venue where you can get a fast and effective remedy that's not left totally up to the standards body. We've seen a lot of cases, not less in apparel, but more in agriculture, where workers have problems on the ground. They go to Rainforest Alliance, they go to fair trade groups, they go to these different groups that have certified, and it's totally up to the discretion of those groups how they're going to come down. And it really, I think, comes down to what Julia was saying about what reputational risk they then see themselves being subject to, rather than any kind of genuinely fair or independent process. So I think in both cases, in Florida and in our work, we'll be seeing how that binding arbitration goes and how we can improve these agreements in the future.
Mike, you have thoughts on those three questions?
Yeah, I think that this is the most interesting, richest conversation on these topics that I've had in many years. And I want to thank the Rapoport Center and LLILAS for making this all possible for us. I want to make three very brief points. First, going back to Peter's question on domestic demand. FSC certification, or certification under other systems as well, doesn't only apply to the export portion of the production of the company. It applies to the company as a whole. So when Arauco in Chile, or Mininco in Chile, or Duracell in Brazil becomes FSC certified, that means the domestic production as well is certified. And you can find in Brazil now, Peter, the largest amount of FSC certified paper that you normally come across. Every railroad ticket, every bank receipt, every government receipt has the FSC logo on the back of it, because the plantation industry in Chile is almost totally FSC certified. So although you may think that there's less demand for it, once the companies become certified to meet export demand and export conditions, they have lots of that certified product to put into domestic markets. And we see that in a number of companies. I had the privilege of serving as the chair of the FSC Board of Directors when we met in 2012 in Chile, when we met with the Mapuche community in Temuco, and when they asked us to create a study that was focused on the relationship between the Mapuche communities and the Chilean forest products industry. That, I'm happy to say, is the study that Charlie and José are about to finish. I hear that it may actually be released by the middle of March. And we're all extraordinarily interested, myself and the people who are still on the board of directors of the FSC, in the results of their analysis of FSC, indigenous rights, and the forest products industry in Chile. I've gotten some hints about what some of the results are going to be from Charlie and José here, and I think it's going to have a very big impact on the FSC, because one of the other things we created in the last couple of years is a permanent Indigenous Peoples Committee, directly advisory to the Board of Directors on FSC and Indigenous peoples worldwide. And my final comment comes back to China. China also produces for global markets. China is very interested in producing products that will be accepted in global markets, and so very quick anecdote. 8 years ago, I went to China, talked at a conference, and said, you know, a conference of furniture makers and other forest products industry people, said, you really should think about FSC. And they said, no, we have more forestry universities than anyone else in the world, and we know what sustainable forestry is like. I went back there in 2011, and they said to me, you know, this FSC thing is fairly interesting. We're not getting the international markets that we want for our products. IKEA and many other companies are trying to produce here, but they insist on having FSC certified wood, and we're having to import it from New Zealand and South Africa and the United States. All of a sudden, FSC is much more interesting to companies in China, even if the consumers in China aren't that focused on it. The big problem with China is getting things audited. And I think any one of these groups would say that auditing problems in China are a major problem. 2 years ago, there was a cover story in Business Week magazine featuring a Mexican auditing company that essentially said, tell me what the standard is, and I'll make certain that you're audited successfully to that standard. So whether it's fair trade or FSC or even the Red Plus systems within China, getting into China and doing effective auditing is a major challenge for all of us. But thanks again to all of you for listening to us, for participating, for offering fabulous questions, and I really appreciate the efforts of all of my colleagues on this panel.
Thank you, Mike. That sounded like both an answer to the questions and a final statement, so why don't we take that as the sort of the signal to the other panelists that are here present to say any final words that you'd like to. And particularly, you can say whatever you want, of course, and refer to whatever discussion has provoked you. But if you're so inclined, I know the Rapoport Center is very interested in this last point that Mike alluded to about challenges. What are the real contradictions, limitations, challenges of certification systems that you know best face in the future? I know that Sean, in the video that you shared with me, there's Immokalee workers are thinking a lot about scaling and what comes next after these great successes. That's one kind of challenge. But I'm curious about where you see, both in terms of research and in terms of the practice of the organizations that you're associated with. What's the horizon looking like? In addition to whatever else you'd like to briefly conclude before we wrap up. In the order I didn't specify. Why don't you start, José?
Okay, great. Well, I really agree with what Mike was saying. This has been a really rich discussion, and I think it's really helpful to get out of these kinds of silos of environment, human rights, and labor, and really have a conversation across those about the dynamics that I think we're seeing across all of those issue areas. I think, in terms of challenges, I think something that Sean and I were talking about before the panel, and he alluded to, is the fact that without constant scrutiny, the companies that we deal with are constantly going to be trying to find ways to sort of avoid full implementation of what they have committed to. And that's certainly something we found with the Bangladesh Accord, is that companies, I didn't talk about this, but really the reason a lot of these brands signed on is that there was a huge amount of international attention after a factory collapsed and 1,100 people died. And there had been, at that point, the unions and NGOs had already come up with this model of the Accord. No one had signed on. And then in this crisis moment, we were really able to get those commitments. And since then, they've been, I think a lot of them have realized that they've now made this legally binding commitment that they can't just ignore the way they've ignored their other CSR commitments. And so that's one, I think, in terms of areas for the future, it's going to be exploring that and both figuring out how to really continue to hold their feet to the fire and make sure the mechanisms work, and then trying to use that as a model to expand in other sectors. Also in that category, Julia had asked me to talk about an issue that's been coming up on campus here, which is that Nike has announced that they're no longer going to allow the WRC into their factories. And that was very concerning to us because it's always been our understanding that universities were expecting of their licensees that as part of code compliance, they would allow the university's designated monitors into the factory to assess what was happening. And I think for all the reasons that we've been discussing for the past 2 hours, we do feel that these companies have not shown that they can police themselves, and that type of external access is really important. And so I'm sure that's a discussion that will be continuing here about how the university wants to engage with Nike around that, and what steps the university wants to take to ensure that the UT code is enforced. Thank you.
Oh, maybe I continue this order. Basically, I thank the organizers for this, inviting me to attend to this panel. I have to say that certification was actually Charles who invited me to be part of this challenge with analyzing, assessing the certification process in Chile. We haven't focused as a human rights...
Not quite ready for gin tonics yet there, Mike.
It's okay.
We haven't really focused in our work on certification, but rather on the recognition of international human rights standards at the domestic level, and moreover in the adjudication. So this has been a challenge. I have also to admit that the consumer's focus is not one I had worked, and it's not one, although I admit that it's a strong perspective, and it's related to rights. It's not one that I had worked in the past. But having said that, my comment would be to encourage the Rapoport Center and LLILAS to move on with this research project on resource governance and natural resources. I feel that there's my perspective, there's a huge tension between two forms of globalization. One, the globalization of markets, and the other, the globalization of human rights, which is a process that has been going on for the last 50 years. And the way it relates, particularly in the context of an increasing extractive industry and a globalized world, a globalized economy, is one of the challenges that I suppose that you're facing, and I'm more than happy to collaborate from a Southern perspective in this initiative. Thank you.
Just wanted to say thank you again to the Rapoport Center and the event organizers. It's a pleasure to be back at UT after a few years away. The challenges facing us really do have to do with scale and the question of replicability, speaking from the perspective of the Fair Food Program. As I mentioned earlier, I think it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the Vermont dairy industry. It's sort of a different host organization that will be launching this process. For us within the Fair Food Program, we're now in 7 states, 3 crops, probably about 40,000 jobs covered by the program. And we have to figure out how to grow that, and that comes down to resources. And everyone's familiar with, questions around financial resources, and we actually have, I think, some pretty good strategies in place around that. But the question that the challenge that's been even more pressing in some ways is that of human resources, and that is getting people who want to move to Florida and do this work, who don't want to live in Chicago or New York or Austin or the other 10 places where educated young people move to these days, but who actually will move to the South, outside of Austin, and do this kind of work, and who want to be a part of developing this new model. And it's a tremendous challenge. I mean, I've been trying to get people out there for 5 years, and we do it, there's some people who want to, but it's remarkable the sort of hesitancy we encounter for people to step outside their comfort zone to do what is just truly remarkable work, and from the relative, from the safety and comfort of Sarasota, Florida, you're not going to get killed doing this. I mean, it's just sort of mind-boggling. So anyway, human resources continue to be a problem. And so if you know of students or people who you think would be a good fit for this, with a legal background or not, please send them our way. On the question of research, I mean, where my mind goes is the process of vetting out these various schemes, right, of sorting them out. What is real, what promises change on the ground versus what is essentially an extension of corporate marketing departments. And I think, you know, I'm not as optimistic that that can just be left to consumers, because I think most people see the sticker, they assume it's good, they buy it in good faith, and that's kind of where it stops. And so I actually think research institutions can play a very important role in collaboration with other stakeholders in this, of really pushing that question and calling people out when they need to be called out.
Great, thank you, and I very much agree with everyone that it's been a wonderful discussion, and thank everyone for participating in it and everyone for coming. In concluding, I'd just like to connect it with our broader project on human rights and economic inequality, that in some ways we've been talking about what role certification schemes have got to play in enforcing minimum standards. But maybe we haven't thought about so much about whether certification can play a role or what role there is in terms of addressing the distribution of profits or the distribution of risks within a supply chain. So we might still have, you know, minimum labour standards being complied with in one place, but it doesn't mean that 90% of the profits from that particular industry are still concentrated in one part of the chain. So I want to sort of pose those general questions around inequality within supply chains and what the question of certification is there.
Thank you all.